Hello, my name is Izan Bush, and this is my interpersonal communications project for the Liberty University Online Human Services Counseling 508 class. Next slide. A brief introduction about myself is that I am a graduate student pursuing my master's in Human Services Counseling with a concentration in marriage and family. I'm a proud Christian on fire for the Lord, and I'm also a proud spouse to my husband of almost 4 years. I currently work as a work and family life consultant, assisting service members and their families on their transition out of the military. My hobbies include singing, dancing, and curling up with a great movie. Next slide. What is communication? Interpersonal communication. I did some research and I stumbled upon an article entitled Psychological Perspectives on Interpersonal Communications. There, comparisons of definitions of interpersonal communication were listed. Some of them included: interpersonal is derived from the prefix inter, meaning between, and the word person. Communication exists on a continuum from impersonal to interpersonal. The second, the imparting, conveying, or exchange of ideas, knowledge, information, etc., whether by speech, writing, or signs. And the third definition I gathered from the article was: interpersonal communication can mean the ability to relate to people in written as well as verbal communication. This type of communication can occur in both a one-on-one and a group setting. Next slide. So, I then looked for the definition of interpersonal communications as written by John Stewart, the author of Bridges, Not Walls. He explained that interpersonal communication is the type or kind of communication that happens when people involved talk and listen in ways that maximize the presence of the personal. I also came up with my own definition, and I said that interpersonal communication is the unique and heartfelt exchange of either verbal or nonverbal messages through talking and listening between people. Next slide. So, communication can be broken up into verbal and nonverbal. In Burley Allen's book, she took information from two psychologists, one Albert Morabian and the other Arnold Harrison. So, Morabian described that communication is broken down into words used, which composed of 7% of communication. 38% of communication came from tone of voice, and 55% of communication came from body language, which is the posture, eye contact, and facial expressions. Arnold Harrison's percentages were slightly different, as he discovered that words used made up about 35% of communication and body language made up the remaining 65%. Next slide. My overarching goal is to learn more about myself and why I communicate as I do, so that I may be able to improve my communication and relate on a more intimate level with my future clients, coworkers, and family and friends. Learning to communicate effectively will assist me with guiding others toward enlarging their conversation personally and professionally. Another goal is also to listen at a level 1. Listening well can improve how effectively you work with your business associates, coworkers, and community volunteers. This quote was taken from Peterson for Why Don't We Listen Better? Next slide. A little bit of a background about myself. I'm 26 years old. I married my high school sweetheart, and I received my bachelor's in early childhood education. I have one older sister who was recently diagnosed with high-functioning autism spectrum disorder. My mother, who's a loving, highly protective fixer, she remarried, and from that marriage, I now have 2 younger stepsisters and 1 older stepbrother. I was born to 2 parental performers. I also noticed that communication was a bit of a struggle within my family, whether it be within marital communication, parental communication, and also within the sibling communication. I was born a Marine brat. My father retired, and my parents divorced when I was 6, and I became estranged from my father, and I was thus raised by my mother and grandmother in South Carolina. My upbringing was very old school. Children were to be seen and not heard. But both my mother and my grandmother were strong survivalist women. They both received college degrees. My mother received her degree in psychology, and my grandmother was an ambitious entrepreneur. Next slide. Behavioral blends. So, the behavioral blend is the combination of an individual's traits and characteristics that come together to craft one's behavioral temperament. They broke this down into 4 temperament models: dominant, inspiring, supportive, and cautious. Next slide. My personal behavioral blend for "this is what is expected of me" came out that I was an inspirational specialist. So what this means is that I am considered a perfect people pleaser, or perfect people person. I am also a people pleaser, and I love the crowd and individuals equally. I lack assertiveness, and I'm also fairly sensitive. The results for that were pretty spot on. For "this is me," my results came out that I am a competent influencing specialist, which means that I am outgoing and reserved, warm and friendly, cautious, caring, and a problem solver. Next slide. Communication barriers. I've discovered after reading Burley Allen's book that I listen pretty much at a level 3, which is about a 3% efficiency level. I tend to form advice before the talker is finished speaking, which is considered fake listening. I simply hear the message without listening, and this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but it's definitely not intentional. I need to be more assertive and less analytical, and I tend to be a problem solver. Next slide. Resources and strategies. So, James Peterson spoke in his book about the talker-listener card, otherwise known as TLC. I can definitely see myself utilizing this in the future, as it helps the talker and listener maintain their specific roles. The talker is to share their feelings and thoughts without accusing, attacking, or judging. And the listener is to provide a safe space to understand and clarify information without agreeing, disagreeing, or advising. This seems to be an issue for me. I need to learn to stay quiet and not always try to fix the situation. I also need to practice encouraging feedback rather than praise. Next slide. I also plan on utilizing the books that we studied during the class, which were Bridges Not Walls, a book about interpersonal communication by John Stewart, Why Don't We Listen Better by James Peterson, and Listening, The Forgotten Skill by Madeline Burley Allen. Next slide. Continuing on with resources and strategies, I found an article that related to my current situation. With my sister's recent ASD diagnosis, I wanted to find out how that affected her communication, because we've always noticed that my sister was socially awkward. So the study was done on 2-year-olds, and they found that 5 core social communication deficits between 18 to 24-month-olds would actually provide insight onto the effects that ASD would have on the child's future communication. So the 5 areas that they identified, or that they took information from, were from the gaze shifts, gaze/point follow, rate of communicating, acts of joint attention, and the inventory of gestures. Next slide. My action plan. I plan to pray for an open mind, to be used as a willing vessel to convey God's messages, free from my own opinions and biases. I plan to pray for an open heart, to feel compassion and empathy for those of whom I come in contact, and to pray for open ears to listen effectively, being careful not to allow my mouth to override my listening. I also plan to practice effective listening, paying attention to verbal and nonverbal cues with my husband and within other intimate relationships. Practice makes perfect. I also plan on working on mindful listening, being careful to avoid being overly metacognitive about my listening. Next slide. In conclusion, this class has opened my eyes to help me to realize that despite my well intentions, my ears have been relatively closed off to effective listening. I will take this new knowledge and work to improve my interpersonal communication skills to enhance my abilities on my journey to fulfill God's plans for me. I will leave you with this scripture, James 1:19. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Thank you, and God bless you.